Okay, now I'm going to ask like two more questions, and now I'm going to let you go. I know I've already borrowed too much of your time.
Oh, it's no problem. I'm enjoying it.
So I think once again we're running into the United States of amnesia, where we forget like what you just said. Here we are, 47, 48 years later, and we're still kind of going through the same. 38 years later, almost 40 years later, we're almost going through the exact same thing. Similar things done over and over and over again, but yet we tend to analyze them in a vacuum. Like we don't look at what happened in the past at all. We're just assuming that this is happening right now in a vacuum and none of that other stuff even matters. And I think that's wrong.
And the media is so guilty of this. As a journalist, I'm so consciously aware of the fact it's not necessarily individual journalists' fault, but that there is no historical context for stories. And when you read a news article, they might provide at most a paragraph to whatever the historical background is, but we can't understand what's going on today without this context. And unfortunately, it's almost always divorced. And I would say sometimes intentionally, because you can only believe that the U.S. is interested in freedom and democracy if you ignore all of U.S. history. Like, let's be real here. The U.S., this is a country that was founded on genocide of native peoples. It was founded on slavery and the subsequent subjugation of women until 1920, and then the systemic racism and apartheid against Black Americans until the 1960s. And then since then, the U.S. has waged genocidal wars in Vietnam and Korea. The U.S. has overthrown dozens of foreign governments on behalf of the interests of multinational corporations. The U.S. has backed dictators throughout the world. The U.S. has sided with, fascists in Latin America, in the case of the Contras, or, even right-wing Islamists in the Middle East, like we're seeing today. So you cannot think that the U.S. is somehow magically going to support peace and freedom and democracy and progress and all these good things now if you know all of that history, which is why that history is frequently left out.
And what's so interesting is like I don't know if this is like Hollywood's deal, but they want to spin a tale of like a white knight versus a black knight, and I hate to use those terms, but you guys know what I'm talking about, like the hero of the United States, the heroism of the United States versus some villain, whatever that villain may be, like just a terrible individual, a villainous person. Like there's no virtue, there's no mixed bag, like. That's the tale that they want to spin. And every time we buy into it without looking at the situation, we're just kind of empowering it. And that's why it's very important to try to understand both our own history and then also to help better understand kind of what's going on in the present based off the past. Because a lot of times they're doing the same things, like tactics are tactics. You can find, Roman tactics. They use that as SWAT police today. Those are like Roman, like hoplite formation and stuff like that. That's what the SWAT police use. So to say that, okay, well, we're just not going to acknowledge that that's where it comes from, it just kind of like loses context. It just makes you unable to understand and properly interpret, maybe what's going on. Instead, you're kind of like stuck in the illusion.
Absolutely.
So the last question I want to ask you, Ben, is why should the left and progressives in general be involved in foreign policy, and why is it important?
Well, I would say, to be honest, I'm not trying to downplay the importance of other issues, but I think it's the most important issue for Americans in particular. It's important for every people throughout the world, and, respective peoples for their respective countries. But in the U.S., it's so important because the U.S. is the largest empire in human history. Not just in the world today, but in human history. The U.S. has according to its own estimates, more than 150,000 military personnel in more than 150 countries throughout the world. The U.S. has some 800 foreign military bases, which is 95% of the world's foreign military bases. It's obscene, the levels of our military control over the planet. You look at
some people, most of the people that are learning in foreign policy circles, they'll say like, if the United States wasn't doing, let's say some things like, if you're against the United States empire, some other empire would rise. There has always been a global hegemonic empire. What do you think about that?
Well, there actually has not always been a global hegemonic empire. Actually, for the rest of history, there have been competing empires. And we're coming out of the only moment in world history, because technology allowed it to happen, where there was a global empire that basically was uncontested. And I would say that after the end of World War II, of course, you have the rise of two main powers. Before World War I, you have a kind of multipolar order. The British Empire is the largest empire, and at its peak, the British Empire, estimates say, it controlled around 25% of global territory. It was a very brutal empire. You look at India, you look at parts of Africa where there were massive famines that killed millions of people, genocidal use of violence. I mean, but the British Empire was still not as big as the U.S. empire is, and that's simply because the U.S. military has allowed it to exercise this dominance, and also economic institutions like I mentioned, the IMF and World Bank. But the U.S. spends more on its military than all other countries in the world. And actually, if you take the next 8 largest countries in terms of their militaries and combine them, that's how much the U.S. spends, or the rest of the world combined. So when you look at these past empires, in World War I, there were competing empires, and that's what led to World War I. And then after World War I, you have moved toward World War II, you still have this multipolar world order. And then after the destruction of World War II, which was the most horrific conflict in history, 60 million people killed, most of the Soviet Union completely burnt to the ground by the Nazis, large parts of Western Europe destroyed, millions of 10 to 20 million Chinese killed. It was a horrific, destructive conflict. The U.S. was largely immune to a lot of that destruction. Again, 400,000 Americans died. That's still a lot. But the U.S. did not have its economy destroyed. In fact, the U.S. had its economy grow very rapidly through World War II by creating weapons and ammunition. And after that, you, of course, have the rise of the Cold War. The U.S. and the Soviet Union are the two, or in the Soviet Union and its allies, are the two main powers. And then after the collapse of the Soviet Union, you have basically uncontested U.S. domination. And we're seeing the decline of that. The U.S. empire is on the decline. And I think we're moving back to a kind of pre-World War I multipolar order where the U.S. is still the strongest power, but China, Russia, Iran, Brazil, South Africa are exerting more influence internationally.
Yeah, and I think that's quite clear, in the mad scramble to restructure things and structure things to try to maintain that dominance, that it just might not be possible. But I want to pick up on something that you said right there that was very, very, very important, but I just totally forgot what it was. See, this is why you can't have these kind of conversations. These are great stimulating conversations. But the point I want to make, I'm going to play devil's advocate. I agree with everything you just said, by the way. But somebody else had spoken to me about this, and they say, well, back in the past, they didn't actually know all about the entire globe. Maybe it was impossible for them to have like a global order in the real sense of the word, but all of what they knew, they conquered, and then they had like a global, from their perspective, dominance in that sense. What do you think about that? I thought that was preposterous too, but go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a ridiculous argument. People have known about the world for hundreds and hundreds of years. Even the whole notion that in 1492 Columbus was sailing west and they thought the world was flat. These are all ridiculous ideas. I mean, actually, Europe had been going through a dark ages. Meanwhile, the Middle East was going through its golden ages. There's evidence that people had already been to the so-called New World. It's only called the New World because Europeans didn't even know what it was. So, no, I mean, for hundreds of years, people have known about other parts of the world. I think the main difference is simply technological.
Yeah, and that's the argument I made. Could you imagine trying to maintain an empire where you're giving orders to, different regions and you're sending out orders, but it takes like months for your orders to get there?
Well, and then also militarily, how do you prevent people from violently resisting, from engaging in self-defense?
It takes months to allocate resources and troops and get them there. By that time, it's already too late. You're already beaten. And
the creation of the Air Force in particular. I actually Tariq Ali, who's a leftist historian, who's very interesting. He one time articulated a model of history, which I think is pretty accurate. He pointed out that the British Empire, which had been the largest empire before World War I and leading up to World War II, was a naval empire. At that moment, before the creation of large air forces, it was able to dominate parts of the world using its enormous navy, which no other power could compete with. And then leading up into World War II and after World War II, the Air Force became the new form of military domination, and the U.S. had the most powerful Air Force. And I think it's instructive to think of history in terms of these kinds of technological shifts. And again, I'm not saying that we should think about everything in history in terms of technology. That's ridiculous. But it's just to see how things have shifted so drastically with the creation of electricity, and then later the creation of the airplane, the internet. I mean, phones, like these forms of technology are in some ways very good, but then they're also double-edged swords, and it can be used for military domination. And we see that with the growth of the U.S. empire.
And with that in mind, what we should also think about is, what does that mean for newer technologies or new emerging frontiers, things like space? Militarization of space is very, very real. It's very, very real. I believe that, when you look at the United States and their space program in particular, we should be trying to make sure that our space program does not become a new space for world domination, basically, a new frontier for that. And I think that that's something we have to be aware of as technology continues to change and it kind of does stuff. But I do agree, though, technology mostly is neutral. It's just a tool. It depends on who's using it and for what purpose.
Absolutely.
So I think, go ahead.
No, you said it very well. I've been ranting too much, so.
Okay, well, I mean, the whole point of having somebody with your expertise, and I keep saying this, the whole point of having somebody with your expertise on is so we can kind of go through these issues. I would have really liked in this conversation for us to take some time and particularly talk about Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Chile, if at all possible. But I guess we'll probably have to slate that for another time if you have time, if you wanted to come back. But I think those are conversations that definitely need to be had. And I'll just bet you have some closing arguments on anything that we've said today, and I'll go ahead and close this out.
Well, we've had a lot of good discussions here and addressed a lot of good issues. I would end with one final note, and it's in relation to a question you asked a few minutes ago that I didn't completely answer. And that is that one of the reasons I think that not just Americans overall, but especially people on the left should prioritize foreign policy and anti-imperialism is because we have a political obligation. And not just political, a moral obligation too. But I don't think we should think about politics just in terms of our feelings and morality and emotion. I mean, that is important. I'm not trying to downplay that. But as Americans, as citizens of the largest empire on the planet, we have a political obligation, especially those of us who are progressive and who want to fight forms of injustice and oppression and who feel a sense of solidarity with people in the global south trying to resist imperialism and global domination and neoliberalism and war and all these destructive constructs. We, like it or not, have been beneficiaries of the U.S. empire. That doesn't mean that these wars were waged on our behalf by any stretch of the imagination. No, they were not. Wars are waged for corporate profit, for political control, for access to resources and markets. They're not waged for average people. However, by making the largest empire in the world and by exploiting people in the global south, we've had access to a lot of commodities, to many other things that have made our lives slightly better. That doesn't mean that there's no poverty in the U.S. It doesn't mean that there's no inequality. Things are still very bad domestically. But we, like it or not, are complicit in what's happening. And that's why, especially in a country that's supposedly a democracy, that professes to care about its own citizens' views, we should be vociferous in our opposition to these policies, and we should be steadfast in our support for resistance movements and for progressive struggles against imperialism, against militarism, and against neoliberal capitalism throughout the world.
Now, I know that was supposed to be like the closing argument, but now you opened up a whole new can of worms. So let me ask you this. I understand that, we might not want to necessarily be in our emotions because I feel like our emotions are what allow us to be tricked. Like, just like we kind of fall for the white knight versus the villain or whatnot. I think, when you're thinking of things from an emotional standpoint, it's very, very easy to obfuscate the truth, and sometimes, also on the same hand, the truth might be uncomfortable. And what you said was, we are complicit. And some people might not be comfortable understanding that when you haven't held your politicians to account for their foreign policy, and their foreign policy is so horrific that we're, complicit in that. And, when I try to make that point, that when you supported George W. Bush and that administration did all these things and, all these war crimes per se, and it's not just his administration. He's not the only administration that's done it. Truman has done it, and so on and so on. When you support these administrations, you are supporting war criminals, war crimes. You're supporting what they do. You're complicit in their actions. And people just aren't ready for some reason to take that step. And I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's the least evil, the least worst paradigm that we seem to be stuck in here, that we just can't happen to overcome that. We just can't happen to leave that era. But for whatever reason, we really do need to leave that paradigm and start really acknowledging these hard truths. Like you said, we've been indirectly beneficiaries of these policies, and we're the only people who have any hope to put a stop to them, at least right now.
Especially if our government claims to be democratic. And of course, the U.S. has never been a democracy. But, as I mentioned, until 1920, women couldn't vote. Black Americans were systematically subjugated until the 1960s. And since then, our political system is still dominated by large corporations and banks and financial interests. So we're not a democracy. But if the government claims to be one, then we should be taking it at its word and demanding that our politicians do what we want. And
let me ask you a
war
question.
War is unpopular. Regardless of someone's political views, war is unpopular.
It is. That is why you see all of this, all these massive machinations. That is why you see the media making sure that they're very, very pro-war, because they have to build up public support for these things when the United States goes out and does this. And this is one of the biggest arguments I'll make for people when they say, well, our opinion doesn't matter. If your opinion doesn't matter, they wouldn't spend so much money to control it.
Exactly.
If your opinion didn't matter, they wouldn't spend as much money to make sure that your opinion is controlled and within the bounds of their framework. And another example of this would be, let's say, the healthcare legislation. The people's voice mattered, when it came to leaving from the Affordable Care Act to, a less Affordable Care Act, when the Affordable Care Act wasn't affordable to begin with, right? But the people's voice mattered in that decision. But it mattered from within the framework that they set. The choice wasn't either do single payer or the Affordable Care Act. The choice was you either have the Affordable Care Act or something worse than the Affordable Care Act. And you just do the least worst, and now you're stuck with what you got. You see how that works? Like, if I bound the political thought on what's possible or what should be done, or what's in front of you right now, like, you really can't get outside of that. You're always going to be acting from within the bounds that they set for you. And foreign policy is the same exact thing. In the liberal discourse, you'll hear people say, regime change. They'll talk about regime change. Like you said, Bernie Sanders spoke about regime change and started talking about the history. But, when he was actually confronted in a debate for his support, years ago for some of the things that the Sandinistas was not Sandinistas. Excuse me.
Well, he opposed the Contras and he supported the Sandinistas.
Yeah, but
are you talking about the town hall protest a few years ago?
Yes.
Yeah, there was a town hall protest because he
backtracked.
Yeah, well, in 2014, Israel brutally bombed Gaza, killing 2,251 Palestinians, 2/3 of whom were civilians, according to the UN. And politicians in the U.S. were uniformly supporting Israel. It wasn't just Bernie Sanders. Elizabeth Warren was asked in an interview on video if she could speak, and she literally walked away. But there was a protest where protesters went to a town hall that Bernie Sanders was holding, and they disrupted it and were chanting, support Palestinians, condemn the Israeli government's war crimes against Palestinians, and yeah, like Bernie Sanders grew a lot on the issue of Israel-Palestine, and he, in the Brooklyn debate here, he boldly stood up and said that Palestinians deserve equal rights, and Palestinians, have been oppressed by Israel.
But still, even when he did that, it was like a trying to play both sides kind of deal. It was a very cautious criticism. And I made a point about this in my show. Like, I was like, that's not a critique of Israel. That's just acknowledging that Palestinians are people. That's the baseline assumption, that they are people and they are entitled to certain inalienable rights, right? That's a baseline.
But also, it shows how mainstream anti-Palestinian bigotry is. Palestinians have been so dehumanized in U.S. political discourse that saying that they're human beings who deserve equal rights is controversial.
Exactly. That is a good point. But what I was talking about, I hated that I said it, but it's Sandinista, not Sandernista. That's why I kind of stopped myself, because I was like, oh, I can't believe I made that mistake. But I remember he was confronted for his support for some of the Sandinista policies back in the past. They brought that back up on him, and he had to backtrack from it. When I'm like, no, this is long, that history is long understood. You can boldly stand and say, yeah, I supported these things that they did. You don't have to backtrack. Yet he still didn't have the courage to backtrack because he was afraid that the public didn't necessarily know the truth, or he just didn't want to stand up on that issue. He backtracked on it and tried to kind of say like he didn't say that, or he didn't say this. And I'm saying that kind of political action is kind of why, even though he's done many things correctly, why we also need to still continue to pressure him. My question, though, is if we're stuck inside the bounds of the establishment, how do we move out of those bounds if we're stuck in least worst? Like, even Bernie Sanders is a compromise in many respects, right? You won't be able to begin to wind down U.S. empire with Bernie Sanders. At best, you would maybe be able to make it so not outrageous.
Yeah, this is the question. What is to be done? And it's a very, very difficult question. Personally, stepping a little bit out of the more objective, like journalistic framework and moving into more of like my own political views, I don't think the Democratic Party is the way of the future. It simply has been too much of a corrupt right-wing institution for so long, and I don't think it can be reformed. And I think what's ironic is I think Bernie Sanders recognizes that, because he's now a Democrat. This is the irony. I think he's way too soft in the Democratic Party, but why is he not a Democrat? And it's because he, at least in the past, recognized, you go back to speeches he gave in the 80s and 90s where he was like, on many issues, Republicans and Democrats are indistinguishable. And I think when you look at Tom Perez and you look at how not only was Sanders' campaign stabbed in the back by the Democratic Party, Ellison's was as well for the leadership of the DNC. But it demonstrates.
Let me come in there, and I'm going to poo-poo all over that, because I understand that Bernie Sanders has done many things correctly, but we should also see some of like his limitations as well. Like, absolutely. I think in order to move us beyond where we are, it requires maybe a little bit of a fearlessness. And I think maybe Jeremy Corbyn may be more in line with what that should look like in terms of being in the political arena. Even he has issues too, right? But I believe like that model of politician there, the way, even though the public is not with him, he puts the idea out there to prepare the public for people that will follow in his line, so to speak. Maybe the public doesn't come to him today, but maybe somebody else follows in his line and the public is ready for that message later. Just by virtue of the message being out there, you're sort of getting the public used to that discourse. And I think that when it comes to Bernie Sanders, he's just not strong on making sure that he's out there, whether it's popular or not anymore. And he also has a tendency to defer to his political opposition and give them cover with his credibility, which is also not a good viable strategy in the long term. You don't want to give your political opposition access to your political capital when they have none of their own. You should make sure that everybody knows that they're bankrupt and use it to build your own power. and to be separate from them.
No, I agree. I mean, I wasn't using Sanders as an example of an ideal. I was using Sanders simply because many people know who he is. It's a good base. Like for people who are new to a lot of these issues and new to politics to the left of the Democratic Party, Bernie Sanders is the bare minimum, like the baseline that we can draw off from. And I think Corbyn he's a great politician. He's someone I absolutely admire. And he's also, when it comes to the weaknesses that Sanders has, Corbyn is someone who makes up for those. Corbyn's foreign policy is great. He's consistently anti-imperialist. He's been speaking out for Palestinian rights, speaking out for the rights of people throughout the global South for many years. He actually was arrested for protesting apartheid in South Africa when no one discussed that issue. However, I think we should go even further. Corbyn is great, but I think, as people interested in progressive left-wing socialist politics, we should look at leaders throughout the global South in particular. And, there are good politicians in the West, but many of the left's strongest leaders in history have been in the global South, in the so-called Third World. People like Hugo Chavez. Hugo Chavez did so many amazing things. I mean, that's a whole long conversation, but
I'm smiling because I have a lot of admiration and respect for Hugo Chavez, and I even when I encounter people who are from the country, a lot of times they're more on the opposition side. But
it's also important to remember it's like Cubans in the U.S. In the U.S., especially in the South, many of the people from Venezuela and Cuba and other countries are actually, they're part of the right-wing opposition. Many times they're rich. There's this term for Cubans, gusanos, right? Like people who fled after the Cuban Revolution. Many of them own property. They own slaves. They're from rich families. So I'm not saying everyone who opposes Hugo Chavez from Venezuela is a right-wing rich person who owns slaves. But it's important that when we tokenize people and say, oh, they're speaking on behalf of Venezuelans, or they're speaking on behalf of Cubans, well, not necessarily. I mean, it's like meeting an American who likes George Bush and saying, oh, well, maybe there are people, maybe George Bush isn't actually that bad. The politics are more complex. And again, Chavez is just one character. There are many, many leaders throughout the world who we can look to as a very positive example of this kind of
Who else would you name?
Yeah, I think there are so many. It depends what part of the world.
Let's stick to South America. Who do you think stands out to you also in South America?
The Sandinistas are a great example. So the Sandinistas, you mentioned, for some context for those who don't know, the Sandinistas were a socialist party in Nicaragua against who the U.S. tried to overthrow, and the U.S. supported fascist death squads known as the Contras, ultra right-wing death squads who massacred civilians trying to topple this government. The Sandinistas, again, that doesn't mean that I'm uncritical of them, but actually Latin America has been a very positive example. Ecuador and Bolivia also. There's been a recent movement. Yeah, what's called 21st century socialism, led by, in Ecuador, you have Correa, and in Bolivia, you have Evo Morales. And recently, actually, Ecuador just had a new election, and they elected Lenin Moreno, who's another socialist. So many of these countries, they have strong socialist movements and that are also firmly anti-imperialist. Bolivia has made so many comments recently in support of international solidarity, opposing military intervention. But you can look at, unfortunately, Latin America had a slew of democratically elected socialist governments that were toppled by U.S.-backed coups.
Sure did.
So in the case of Chile, in 1973, what's known as the first 9/11, on September 11th, 1973, the CIA backed a coup against the democratically elected Chilean socialist government of Salvador Allende, who died in the coup. But it's not even just Latin America. Many other parts of the world. I think Thomas Sankara, who's not very well known, Thomas Sankara was a socialist leader in Burkina Faso, who was unfortunately murdered in another coup by Burkinabe, who was a U.S.-backed right-wing dictator. But in Burkina Faso, Thomas Sankara implemented so many amazing socialist policies that I think are really admirable and that should be looked at by people throughout the world and defended. Like, you can go down the list. Also, I mean, I don't want to rehash Cold War history because that is a really long
Yeah,
discussion. But looking
and
at
to be honest, I was gonna point out something that like this is a conversation that I definitely want to actually give you, a full hour that we can sit down and talk about, especially when we're talking about Latin America. So I want to go ahead and basically ask, I think, one more general question about politics here, and then we can go and maybe discuss this at a later date if you have time, because I would love to have you back on again. This has been basically, when I read your writing, and I'm gonna, this is me, my little fanboy, but when I read your writing, I'm just thinking like, this guy's expressing exactly what I think. And when I said this, I pointed this out. I had a debate with Ben not too long ago about Syria, and I think I was wrong where I gave too much support to the Syrian government, just by happenstance. I allowed that to be framed that way. But, exactly what I was expressing in that conversation, was more along the lines of what you've discussed here today. And I got ran through the rails on that, man. People did not like what I was saying about that. And, I discussed issues, about South America, Venezuela in particular, with people that I know from Venezuela. And, again, it's just like you said, if you go and ask somebody, well, let me say this. The basic premise is that somebody who's from a country would know more about a country than somebody who's from the outside. And I'm saying that's not necessarily true. Like, you can find Americans that don't know very much about America, even though they live here. And just like that, you can find, people from Cuba that don't know anything about Cuba before the revolution. You can find people from Venezuela that don't know anything about Venezuela before the revolution. Even though they might have lived through it, they still didn't really know what was going on. They were just there. And so I want to kind of rebel against always deferring to somebody who's from, the country to speak about it, because that's perspective doesn't necessarily mean that they're 100% correct or they know more than somebody who's outside the country. Expertise is expertise, and I think that sometimes we do need to respect that. At the same time, that's not to say that one person can represent or be a token to represent everything going on in the country. I do acknowledge that as well.
But, yeah, well said. It's an important point.
Yeah. It's something that I run into, like, well, you're not from there. You can't speak about it. He's actually from the country. I'm like, yeah, but, I've sat down and put in the time to be able to talk about some of the issues there, and some of the things I raised, he wasn't even, or like in Cuba, I asked for, go ahead.
A classic example of how destructive this is Ahmed Shalabi. Ahmed Shalabi was an Iraqi politician who was sold as the voice of the Iraqi people, and he helped the U.S. invade and destroy Iraq. He is a collaborator, and for hundreds of years, there have been collaborators who have worked with people, foreign aggressors, who are essentially attacking their own people and attacking their own country. And for those who say, well, you have to listen to this person because they represent their country or whatever, I would respond to them saying, do Trump supporters represent all Americans? Do supporters of Bush and Reagan, are they spokespeople for Americans? And is their opinion more valid than someone else's? I mean, tokenizing is not good for politics, and it is usually a cheap rhetorical tactic that is used to try to silence critique and dissent.
Yeah, and I find that a lot of times you'll hear people, particularly the people that are elevated. You're speaking about people that are elevated in the news media to be tokens in front of the vast populace. But even in conversation, like if you run across someone and you're having a political discussion, if you feel like your views are backed, by hard evidence, it's okay to have a discussion, and you don't have to always defer to somebody who's from the region, because you may have some facts that they don't have. You may have some perspective that they don't have, and vice versa. It's okay. All I'm saying is just deference as being the baseline is not necessarily where you should be if you're going to enter that dialogue at all. And for instance, I've encountered people who complain about food insecurity, or who complain about inflation in Venezuela, where if you look at the graph, since the revolution, inflation and food insecurity have gotten better than it was before. And I make the point that people don't do a revolution if things are good. You can't say that it's gotten worse after somebody comes to power during a revolution, because obviously to have the revolution, things had to have been really bad back then. It's just common sense. But again, these are discussions that, like I said, I want to have you on and have them again. I'm going to go ahead and close out because I seem unable to do that after just making one point. The conversation just keeps going and going and going. So I'll close out with this here quote. I'll say, the unexamined life is not a life worth living. So make sure that when you're out there living, guys, that you take the time to question assumptions, to basically have things that are touted as common knowledge or conventional wisdom, have them prove themselves. And if you do that, you will find yourself a much more informed individual.
Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it. It was a good discussion.
Is it off? Did you stop the recording?